It's okay now.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. We're resuming lectures. Today, we're going to see the end of the American direct involvement in Vietnam at last. It ends in an incredible orgy of destruction, but there it is. last time, are there any questions about the direction of things? Remember, I said that I was going to distribute the final on the 19th of January or before, and that it would be reduced according to directives from the department head, et cetera, from down to a choice of 2 out of 6 questions rather than 3 out of 9. And we will be, I think we will, by the time we finish, we'll have completed the whole course, and it will be based on the 28 questions. So are there any questions about how we're proceeding? Okay, and everything will be up on YouTube as well. So we saw last time, I spent a lot of time discussing the formation of this alliance between Washington and Beijing against the Soviet Union, and not only which sort of enabled the United States sort of it assured the United States that it could retain its presence in East Asia. And then I went on at considerable length about the aftermath of all this, which we're living with today. But we're resuming now the actual course of the war. And I would say that we're now in the wake of the fiasco of the American-backed ARVN invasion of Laos and the failure of Operation Lamson 719, the apparent failure of Vietnamization, the inability of the ARVN to fight effectively against the PAVN. And of course, given that, when 1972 arrived, the people up in Hanoi, they were determined to exploit the weakness of the ARVN, the evident weakness of the ARVN, and given the fact that the Americans were withdrawing their last troops, Hanoi decided to launch a great offensive and to end the war by a major three-pronged military offensive, which simply would overcome the ARVN. And they were spurred into action at the end of March 1972 by virtue of Nixon's visit to China. This rang alarm bells in Hanoi. Far from welcoming this development, Hanoi was deeply alarmed, and all of its suspicions were aroused by what Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership had done, because it reminded them of 1954 and what they, in retrospect, regarded as the sellout at Geneva of the interests of the Viet Minh by China and by Beijing at that time. And it looked like this had all been done without any consultation with Hanoi. The meeting between Nixon and Mao, they were evidently making arrangements without Hanoi's agreement. And furthermore, even the Russians were making all sorts of deals with Washington by design, by American design, the peace treaties, sort of with respect to Berlin, the arrangements for Berlin, armaments agreements regarding nuclear weapons, grain deals were being concluded, and Washington was in this way sort of working to sort of make it in the Soviet interest to take a certain distance from Hanoi. So Hanoi sees Beijing making the deal with Washington and Soviet Union doing similar stuff, and they feel that this is a possible sellout, and so this spurs them into action. And so at the end of March 1972, the communist side launches a three-pronged offensive against the Republic of Vietnam and the ARVN. And as I guess I was saying last time, it is three-pronged in the sense that, first of all, we see, well, the total number of PAVN troops is about 125,000. Many of them basically attack across the demilitarized zone in the direction of Hue, the sort of northern capital of the Republic of Vietnam, located about here. Secondly, crossing from Cambodia, two divisions of the PAVN come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they cross into the Central Highlands from Cambodia and attack the city of Kon Tum. So the city of Kon Tum comes under attack. And finally, further down, a third attack is launched roundabout here in the direction of Saigon. Another two divisions of PAVN attack across the Cambodian frontier. So there is this threefold attack across the DMZ, from an attack against Kon Tum, the major city in the Central Highlands, and then an attack in the direction of Saigon. So it's quite formidable. And so formidable that the ARVN troops in the north are forced out of the northern provinces. They flee towards Hue. The city of Kon Tum is completely surrounded, second leg of this offensive down here. And moreover, the communists threatened to take over. The Kon Tum is, of course, just across the border, right here in the Central Highlands toward the north. But the National Liberation Front launches a takeover of the coastal province immediately to the east of Kon Tum. The coastal province is called Binh Dinh. It was long under National Liberation influence, but now they actually seize control of this province. And if this takes place, if Kon Tum is the falls and Binh Dinh is retained by the National Liberation Front, South Vietnam will be split in two, because the north will be isolated and the south onto itself. And finally, there is the threat that perhaps these PAVN troops in the south can make it all the way to Saigon. So you can see that this offensive is extremely serious. It's an extremely serious attack on the part of PAVN. It's an all-out attack with regular troops, but also with National Liberation forces also involved, because the National Liberation Front has come back. They have succeeded in bolstering their ranks after the Tet Offensive. And so this is a major effort on the part of the communist side. Well, How does the United States respond to these threats? It responds by launching an all-out air offensive. Um, it it deploys the majority of its B-52 force from Guam and Thailand. It introduces into the Gulf of Tonkin new carrier formations, attack carriers loaded with planes, who, in support of the B-52s, launch air attacks on these offensives. Moreover, naval forces of the United States operating offshore use their artillery, particularly against the communists attacking across the demilitarized zone. In addition to these, the Americans were extremely well prepared for what the communists attempted to do. They also launched comprehensive attacks using fighter bombers against both targets in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, as well as in Cambodia and Laos. So you have this huge American air offensive called linebacker, a football term, linebacker, meaning the Americans are backing up Arvin, linebacker, in support of Arvin. And this offensive, which includes, by the way, the area of Hanoi and Haiphong, which Johnson had stopped bombing in 1968. Well, Nixon says, forget about it. And they start attacking Hanoi and Haiphong. They even go so far as to mine the harbor of Haiphong. American destroyers lay mines to cripple the resupply of North Vietnam from the Soviet Union. So this counteroffensive by the United States basically breaks the communist offensive. The American air power is so formidable that the communist forces, certainly by the fall of 1972, are forced to fall back as a result. They fail to, they have to fall back from Hue. In fact, they're driven out of the northern provinces and back across the DMC, and their attempt to take Khartoum fails, as likewise their attempt to break through towards Saigon, likewise failed. And the major, certainly the Arvin did the ground fighting, and some, I would say, particularly near Saigon, acquitted, these were elite troops, acquitted themselves reasonably well. But the major reason for the failure on the part of the communists was the overwhelming air power, which forced the North Vietnamese to abandon their offensive, cut the Soviet and Chinese supply lines, and indeed was so heavy around Hanoi and Haiphong that the communists were sort of bludgeoned as a result of this air campaign. Now, at the same time, we note that there was no anti-war protest, or no really visible anti-war protest in the United States against Nixon was doing. This incredibly destructive air campaign was basically completely accepted by American public opinion, and it's not surprising because on August 22nd, 1972, the last American combat troops were withdrawn from South Vietnam. American direct involvement in combat in Vietnam came to an end on the 22nd of August, 1972. And we can say that just in passing, we'll talk more about the cost of the Vietnam War to the United States later on in this lecture, but American combat losses were 53,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. So 53,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. And with the failure of the communist offensive, both sides having broken off the peace talks in Paris. Remember when just before Nixon went to Beijing in January, he announced the secret peace talks in Paris. They had been broken off. Well, now Hanoi and Washington agreed to renew negotiations at the diplomatic table in Paris. So Kissinger goes to Paris and he negotiates with the leading communist negotiator, Lee Duc-Tho. By October 1972, Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho had worked out a peace agreement. A peace agreement between the sides was concluded in Paris in October 1972. But we'll see that it becomes complicated. It's not quite, we're not quite there. But I'm giving you the terms of the agreement because these terms actually did become the terms of the final agreement. So let's now discuss the peace agreement reached by Lee Duc-Tho and Kissinger. By the way, are there any questions about what I said about this air offensive? Okay. The terms of the agreement between Lee Duc-Tho and Kissinger were as follows, October 1972. First of all, Hanoi was forced to agree that President Tu, General Tu, would remain in power. They wanted to get rid of Tu. The communist side had said, no, Tu must go, and a provisional government has to take power. Some sort of a provisional government should take power, and Tu should leave. Well, the communists were not able to do that, and to achieve that, Nixon stood by Tu, and the communists had to allow him to remain in power. On the other hand, the American side, Kissinger had to agree that the provisional revolutionary government, which had been created by the National Liberation Front back in 1969, would be recognized as having political status. Up to this point, the PRG, the Americans, this is just the NLF, this is just the Viet Cong. We're not going to deal with them. Well, the provisional revolutionary government was recognized by the Americans as a political actor in this situation. So General Tu stays, but the provisional revolutionary government is recognized as a political actor. And then the second major agreement was that within 60 days of the ceasefire, Hanoi would hand over all American prisoners in North Vietnam. And there were hundreds and hundreds of American pilots stuck in a prison in Hanoi by this point, that they had been made prisoners as a result of their planes being shot down over North Vietnam. And I forgot, it's probably about 550 American pilots are sitting in this jail in Hanoi. Does anybody know who the most famous of these prisoners was? Senator McCain died not long ago. He was one of the pilots shot down, and he later made a political career. And by the same terms, the United States in this 60-day period following ceasefire would withdraw all of its remaining troops. Its combat troops are gone, but they still had troops there, and these would all be withdrawn. The several tens of thousands of remaining troops would be withdrawn. So that's the second aspect. But a third and very important aspect of this is the Americans gave up their demand that the People's Liberation, the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, leave the territory of the Republic of Vietnam. All through the war, the Americans had insisted that the PAVN were foreign invaders. And they had, one way or another, whether by negotiation or military force, PAVN would have to get out of South Vietnam. The United States dropped this demand because, as a matter of fact, the PAVN was, by this point, in addition to the National Liberation Front, there were a large number of PAVN troops occupying various parts of South Vietnamese territory, and they were not going to leave. And so the Americans sort of gave up trying to force them out. The way this was played was both sides now agreed to the creation of a tripart commission, composed of the representatives of the Republic of Vietnam, representatives of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and various neutral parties in South Vietnam, who would supervise the implementation of this agreement, as well as prepare the way for elections in South Vietnam, which would decide the fate of South Vietnam. So this is a very important term, obviously. The formation of a tripart commission, which is going to enforce the terms of the ceasefire, the delivery of the prisoners, the recognition of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, etc., and the holding of elections is all going to be implemented by this tripart commission. Kissinger had also tried, in terms of this agreement, to get the People's Republic, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, to agree that terms be established for the establishment of peace in Cambodia and Laos at the same time, but the North, Hanoi, refused because they wanted this agreement to be exclusively devoted to solving the problem of Vietnam. Laos and Cambodia could wait, according to them. So this is the agreement. And it is the agreement under the terms of which the Americans ultimately exited from Vietnam altogether. However, getting this agreement to be implemented was not as easy as was thought after October 1972, because when Kissinger was dispatched by Nixon to Saigon to basically present these terms to President Tu, to General Tu. He basically responded by saying, "This is a sellout of the Republic of Vietnam. He told Kissinger to his face, what you're doing is basically selling us out to the communists." And he categorically refused to sign the peace treaty. And as a matter of fact, we know that Kissinger himself personally thought that he didn't say this, but in private, he thought that sooner or later, the communists would take over. This treaty was basically providing a decent interval or a cover by which the United States could get out. And in the aftermath, the communist side would take over, which in fact they did. Kissinger returned empty-handed to Washington after this confrontation with President Tu. And he told Nixon, well, we don't care what President Tu thinks. This is a good agreement. And what we should do is sign the document without President Tu's assent. We'll just disregard his refusal and just go ahead. Meanwhile, Nixon had sort of committed himself because on the 26th of October, when Kissinger came back, he said, well, of course, this is on the eve of the American presidential election. That's very important in terms of the Nixon's ideas. He rushed out and said that peace is at hand. We're about to sign a peace. And then Kissinger comes back and there's no signature from General Tu. Well, as I said, Kissinger said, let's go ahead anyway. But Nixon said, wait a minute. And he refused to sort of basically cut off General Tu at this point. And he decided that he had to do more to get General Tu to agree to this peace treaty. And so what he did was he phones up General Tu and says, listen, in order to ensure you that the Americans remain committed to you, I'm going to send you $10 billion of new military equipment. We will send new planes, new helicopters, new tanks, new trucks, new artillery to equip re-equip the Arvin. And this program was called Operation Enhance. And the Americans actually did deliver this $10 billion, this extraordinary amount of military equipment to the South Vietnamese government. Nixon then ordered Kissinger to go back to Paris to confront the North Vietnamese, to stiffen up the terms of the negotiation in terms which would impress President Tu. And he did this, and he did this in the midst of this election, and Nixon won an impressive victory in the presidential election of 1972. The American public was with Nixon at this point all the way. Hanoi expected Washington to force General Tu to sort of accept the terms of the October agreement. And in a huff, they broke off peace negotiations in the middle of December 1972. And at this point, Nixon, who's, as I say, the air offensive of 1972, as you saw, was enormous. Well, Nixon's orders a second round of this air offensive. The Americans launched Linebacker 2, or as it's sometimes called, the Christmas bombings. And in the second half of December, they unleashed an even stronger air offensive against the communists, particularly against Hanoi and Haiphong. They carry out an unrestricted air bombing attack against Hanoi and Haiphong. The world is shocked by the devastation of this last air campaign. And in the course of this, it's to be noted that, in fact, 21 B-52 bombers were actually shot down, and many others were damaged by SAM anti-aircraft missiles as they came over Hanoi. But never, and some 92 pilots or crew were killed. American crew were killed in these operations. Well, nevertheless, this Christmas bombing seems to have gelled the final conclusion of the peace negotiations. They were resumed in January 1973, and a settlement was reached more or less on the terms of October. There was no real change in the peace treaty, which was ultimately concluded in. So the final peace came in January 1973. And as for General Tu, at this point, having bombed the hell out of North Vietnam and given Tu $10 billion more in military assistance, he told Tu, unless you sign the document, the peace treaty, we will go ahead without you, and we will cut off all further assistance. The United States will completely cut you off unless you you sign. And so, given Linebacker 2, given an enhanced, given Nixon's promise, well, if things deteriorate, we'll help you more. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, by the United States, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and the Republic of Vietnam. And Nixon went on TV and declared that the United States had achieved, quote unquote, peace with honor, peace with honor. And it is true that, given the fact that they had reached this agreement with Beijing, and that they had in a way forced the North Vietnamese to accept at least some of their terms, that the United States did exit Vietnam with some degree of honor. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is that the PAVN forces were established on South Vietnamese soil. And given the balance of forces in Vietnam, sooner or later, the communists would take over. And this was precisely the calculation of Hanoi in signing the peace agreement. They knew that whatever the Americans had given the Republic of Vietnam, that the ARVN could not match the National Liberation Front and the PAVN, and eventually that the communist side would prevail. So, having said all that, I want now to look at the cost of the Vietnam War to the United States, which was considerable. This was a real turning point in the Cold War, and I think it was a turning point in the post-war history of the United States and its imperial power. It was a sort of a signal of what was going to happen later on. In any case, we've already mentioned the fact the casualties, 53,000 American troops dead and 300,000 wounded. But now I'm sort of listing all the bad things that happened to the United States as a result of the Vietnam War. It's sort of important thing. I would underline this. The second thing that happened during the war was the end of the post-war American economic prosperity. Because I think I've mentioned it, and you know that after 1945, after the Second World War, based on consumerism and the mass production of American industry, the United States entered, and its domination over the whole of the non-communist world, the United States enjoyed an unprecedented prosperity, based on consumerism, and which involved incredible prosperity for virtually all segments of the American population. Where people were making more, not merely a living wage, but a good wage, where jobs were ample and people could have things which they never had before. This period of unlimited prosperity for the American populace came to an end. And from this point onwards, real wages either stagnated or declined. And you have the development of an incredibly widening social inequality in the United States from this point onwards. And this has continued right down to the present. And that brings me to the third point, the deepening divisions within the United States. I've talked about economic equality, but also the racial inequality within the United States. The war had brought to the surface, had excited these deep conflicts between whites and blacks in the United States, and these were never overcome and are still an intrinsic part of the politics of the United States. And indeed, I would say that from this point onwards, the United States had gone through a period of what I would call progressive politics, dating from the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and continuing through Truman and Kennedy and Johnson. Well, this was the end of that, and what you have is an increasingly conservative politics becoming predominant in the United States, and a conservative politics which one could say was not bad in itself, but it didn't address the social and political problems that the United States had. You could see this clearly even today with the election of Biden and the clear failure of his attempt to reconstruct American society. It's obvious that given the politics of the American polity, the reconstruction of American society in terms of a New Deal, such as Franklin Roosevelt and his successors were able to do, this seems to be no longer possible. And of course, I would say that it does not look good for the future as a result. I think we can look forward to a second version of Trump down the road. In addition to this conservative drift, I would say the Vietnam War created a deep and abiding trust in American government amongst the American public. Up until this war, the Americans did believe in their government. That all surveys show that Americans believed in the goodness of their leaders, and the Vietnam War ruined that. First of all, Johnson and the deceptions of Johnson administration, well, the Kennedy and the Johnson administration, with respect to the getting involved in this war, and then in the course of it, of course, Nixon and Watergate, and finally as we'll see, the impeachment of Nixon in the wake of Watergate created a level of distrust which has never been overcome. The American public has never recovered its trust in its leaders as it had in the past. Thirdly, there was, at least temporarily, what we call the Vietnam syndrome. As a result of this disastrous involvement in Vietnam, the American public absolutely rejected any further direct American involvement in wars in the third world, wars in the global south. So that American foreign policy was crippled. And it was only very slowly that this so-called Vietnam syndrome was overcome. It was only overcome after a decade. And of course, it was Reagan who, first of all, invaded Grenada in I believe it was in 1983. And then his successor, Bush, invaded Panama, that American troops actually landed in third world countries. Of course, subsequently, 1991, the first Iraq War was a major turning point. From there on, the American military didn't look back. But up until Grenada and Panama, and especially the first Iraq War, following the end of the Soviet Union, the Vietnam syndrome inhibited American foreign policy. And it opened the door, opened the door for, that is to say, defeat in Vietnam opened the door, and the Vietnam syndrome, to a proliferation of third world revolutions of all kinds. In Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, in Guinea-Bissau, in Namibia, in Ethiopia, third world revolution inspired by a kind of third world Marxism developed, and the United States could not do. They did interfere, but they could only do so indirectly. Likewise, in Chile, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, there were revolutions. In Afghanistan in 1978, there was a Marxist revolution. You probably don't even remember this. You don't know of this, but there was, in fact, a Marxist revolution in Afghanistan and a religious revolution in Iran in 1979. The United States at this point was helpless to do anything about these things. And furthermore, a group of third world countries, including Iran, but also Venezuela, prior to the revolution, formed an association called OPEC, and they dramatically increased the price of oil on a world basis. This, coupled with the rampant inflation in the United States, was the beginning of the serious economic problems of the United States, which continued from this point onwards. In addition, we could say, well, the Soviets while the Americans were distracted in Vietnam, the Soviets built up their navy. They built up their nuclear forces. They achieved strategic parity with the United States during the Vietnam War. So I would say that the costs were enormous. However, that being said, this, of course, was not the end of the American empire by any means. The Americans, even with one hand tied behind their back, nevertheless found ways of fighting back. They, amongst other things, in various countries, the United States, in these third world countries which underwent revolution, for example, Nicaragua, they organized secretly counter-revolutionary forces, or as they were called, Contras, who fought proxy wars for the United States. The United States funded and trained these forces in many of these third world countries that I've mentioned, which basically undermined the revolutionary processes in many of these places. Ultimately, the United States deployed drones to supplement these Contra forces in fighting these counter-revolutionary wars. And of course, the draft had ended in the United States as a result of protest, but the United States was able to organize a volunteer army. And given the growing social inequality, the United States was able to find enough poor people in the United States to field its armies as needed. In addition to that, in terms of the Soviet Union and dealing with the Soviet Union, under Reagan, the United States launched what they called Star Wars, wars based on rockets and other forces, which raised the level of military confrontation in the Cold War to new heights. And back home, Reagan was able to introduce neoliberalism and structural adjustment in such a way as to assure that the system, the economic system, the capitalist economic system, was in its own way restored from the 1980s onwards. The people suffered, but of course, the Wall Street and so on, and those people who had money did well out of all of this. So what I would say in conclusion to all this is that this was a signal crisis. It was a sign of trouble. The Vietnam War was that the American empire was in trouble. And sure enough, we see that these troubles, although of course the Americans were fighting back very strongly, nevertheless, they are continuing. And I would say, above all, I would point to the problems within American society, which have not been addressed, as the fundamental weakness which puts the future of American power in the world in question. Well, we'll see, we'll continue basically the end of South Vietnam and the communist triumph in the next class.